Today's scripture reading is Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 14. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored the Lord, his God, and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our reflection today lands us in Exodus chapter 32. And now, despite being 16 chapters after the Israelites complain about their manna in chapter 16, it's actually not too long after that experience. The Israelites, after their manna incident, they go on to complain about not having enough water. And Moses cries out to God for help because these people are insatiable. Moses also gets advice from his father-in-law, Jethro, who tells him to assign leaders or judges to help hear all of the disputes of the people that Moses was handling all by himself. And then in Exodus 20, God actually speaks to the Israelites. And it's this whole process. They purify themselves. They get ready for 3 days to speak to the Lord. And God speaks to them from within this cloud of thunder and lightning and gives them the rules for living and following God that goes on for several chapters. The first 10 are those 10 commandments. And in chapter 24, God invites Moses to come up to the mountain and be with God a while. And Moses leaves Aaron and Hur in charge. And so in Exodus 25 through 31, Moses has spent 40 days up on the summit of this mountain, receiving instructions from God on every religious ritual and topic. Things like a high priest's attire, with the stones carved with the 12 names of the 12 tribes of Israel, the valuable materials to make the congregation tent, which was the sacred and portable main gathering place for the Israelites, the covenant chest, or the Ark of the Covenant, that holds the sacred Ten Commandment tablets, the seat of mercy, or the pure gold cover for the chest, the table of the elements, the golden lampstand, making the altar and the incense, how to make offerings to contribute to this holy place, etc., etc. So Moses has disappeared from sight for 40 days, having what is the longest recorded prayer between a human and God. And the Israelites themselves had this amazing encounter with God where God spoke directly to them, surely an experience that they would tell their children about, but they haven't seen their God or their leader in a month and a half, which apparently is long enough for an entire people to forget about the second and third rule that God spoke to them. You are not to serve any other gods before me, and you are not to make any idol or image of another god. And so a group of Israelites go up to Aaron and say, Moses is who knows where, he might be dead. Make gods for us, Aaron, because we don't know where our God is. And Aaron's actions are a little surprising. I mean, Aaron is meant to be the high priest of this entire community. And God, he spends a lot of time telling Moses in Exodus 28 about Aaron's special garments that he's supposed to wear that will set him apart. It's a beautiful garment with beautiful stones with those 12 names of the 12 tribes of Israel to remind Aaron that he represents the needs of his people, not his own interests. And come on, man, he immediately acquiesces to these people's requests. No hesitation. What happened, Aaron? Come on. What we see in Aaron is a knee-jerk reaction to complaints. Aaron was just getting a taste of what Moses had to deal with as a leader, and it drove Moses to the point where he cried out to God for help. Perhaps Aaron was a people pleaser by nature, and any bit of unhappiness directed towards him needed to be stomped out immediately because it gave him yucky feelings. Perhaps Aaron wasn't a fan of confrontation, and the easiest thing for Aaron to do was to quickly craft a plan to appease them. And maybe Aaron carried a good bit of doubt himself and did not quite understand the commandment of to not follow other gods or make idols. And at first, I don't really understand these Israelites' behavior or Aaron's, because in Exodus 20, they get this amazing, massive sign of God's presence. God literally speaks to them for 3 chapters. Can you imagine? And a month and a half later, they forget this experience and need a statue to worship? And it's very easy to look at these Israelites and condemn their behavior. But if we sit with this story a bit, we might see some similarities in our own lives. When we humans are afraid or faced with a challenge, we feel like we are alone. We often pray to God with a request. We often want God to answer our prayer and fix our problem, but a big part of us just wants reassurance of God's presence. We want to know that God is there. We want to know that the divine is in control when our worlds feel like they are spinning out of control. We want to feel like we are cared for. And we don't always get what we ask God for, but it's especially difficult when we feel ignored. When we don't get any signs of God's presence, we feel alone, and fear starts to really take over. The Israelites were living in the wilderness. Their future is unknown. And for 40 days, they haven't seen a sign of God's presence. Their home that they once knew, Egypt, is forever changed, and they can't go back. And they are having these disputes with one another, and their leader is MIA. Their future is just one giant question mark, and they are living in that super fun period of limbo. So they turn away from the eternal God and look for gods elsewhere, in these earthly things. They look for something physical that they can worship and put their faith in. And at the center of these actions is their fear. Fear that God has abandoned them, fear that they will starve and die in the wilderness without a leader to tell them what to do. And they think they need something physical to worship and reassure them. During this pandemic, have you ever looked for something physical for a sense of security? Have you ever looked for your sense of security in something other than God? Maybe you've been clinging to the news, hoping that what they have to say will make you feel like you are standing on solid ground. I will give you a hint, they won't. Maybe you look to Facebook or social media for some kind of assurance that the world is not spinning out of control. Maybe you look at your own bank account, your own material possessions, a relationship, anything you have right in front of you for some reassurance. Throughout this pandemic, I have looked to so many things for some kind of security. You'd think I would learn my lesson because I never ever find a sense of reassurance in any of those physical human things. I get disappointed, I get let down, and I'm just left feeling more anxious and alone than I did before. The only thing that gives us a true, firm foundation, that gives us peace within chaos, that gives us a good, steady footing on the unknown terrain, is God. Everything good comes from God. All life and breath comes from God. And time again, no matter how much backsliding we do, we come back to God as our rock and our foundation. Perhaps we reach the end of our rope, or we hit some kind of mental wall, and we realize we've been trying to sustain ourselves on something with no spiritual nutrition. We realize we haven't spent any time with God lately, or remembered God's goodness to us in the past. And we look at all these physical things, these false idols that we create, and we realize that none of them truly sustain us. It's God that watches over us. It's God that will bring us out of this dark time. It's God who is in control, even when we feel like our world is spinning out of control. Like the Israelites and like Aaron, we have to be careful about catering to our own fear. Fear is what drives us to those false gods, those things that will not sustain us and leave us feeling more alone than before. We have to make that conscious difficult choice of faith over fear. Faith in those things that we cannot see. Now, I personally know how hard this is. I am preaching to you and to me. But perhaps next time you feel yourself needing God's presence, needing some sort of sign that God is there, make a conscious choice to set aside your distractions, any of those false idols that you might want to run to, the things of this world, and sit in God's presence instead. The next time you feel afraid, sit in God's presence and talk to God. And remember that the most common phrase in the Bible is "do not fear." Be with God. Put your trust in God and not in the latest news headlines. Practice faith and not fear. We are going to conclude our service today with one of my favorite songs at the moment, "You Make Me Brave" by Bethel Music. I love it because it is God that makes us brave. It is God that calls us out into the unknown and will sustain us. Having faith, it is an act of bravery. Having faith in things unseen is an act of courage. A way of living that says, I will not let my fear control me anymore. I worship the God, the eternal, that created the world, that led the Israelites out of Egypt. And my God will lead us out of this pandemic too. Have faith, my friends, not fear. Amen.